What best way to do it than to use a Netflix show? What the show really does is that get into this core idea that victimhood is not always legible, even to the victims. 90% of stalking victims are stalked by just one person during their lives. Hi, welcome to the Bol Breakdown. In the last episode, I took you through the first recorded case of cyber harassment. It occurred all the way in 1993, the year World Wide Web became publicly available. Almost the first thing we did, apparently. And one of the key conversations that kept happening in that entire instance was, if nobody was touched, was the crime even real? In 2026, which is 33 years since then, this question has all but become redundant. We don't ask questions about how online is affecting offline. I think it's prevalent everywhere. Instead, crimes now, no matter which format they take, so everything ranging from your social media to telephones to digitech, all of this has become integral into how crime is done in the real world. One of the most common cases of that is cyberstalking, and that's what this episode is going to be about. We will be covering the most consequential form of online violence. It also has the most depressing stats, so let me just warn you up front. And we have moved from the text-based virtual world of 1993 to a time where our phone is almost on us all the time, which is not just concerning, but also scary, because that means someone tracking our phone will also know where we are. I'll introduce you to the concepts and the definitions in a bit. But before that, let's get the touch and feel of this. And what best way to do it than to use a Netflix show? I think it was 2 years ago that Scottish comedian Richard Gadd came up with a show called Baby Reindeer. It got all the buzz. Everyone was writing op-eds and articles on it. The show was based on his real-life encounter with a stalker. Before we get into the details, let me just quickly summarize the story. So I'll read that. In the show, Donnie Dunn, a struggling comedian, works as a bartender in a London pub. One day, a woman very visibly distressed walks in. Her name is Martha. He feels sorry for her, so he gives her a cup of tea, has a few formal or polite conversations. And what follows after that are months of harassment from Martha. Martha keeps sending him messages on social media, where at first they're flattering and then they're just obsessive. The volume is staggering. There are like thousands of emails, hundreds of letters, voicemails. I mean, it doesn't end there. She starts showing up at his workplace, his performances, eventually even starts connecting to the people he loves. At this point of time, God realizes that he needs to go to the police. And you would think, what took him so long? Well, that was the question the cops also asked. Dunn takes a long time to recognize the abnormality of the situation. And the showmakers do a brilliant job of adding the layers to the victim's character. So there is a sense of shame, there are prior trauma, there is a dependency that he has. He's a complete human, so he has mixed emotions. There's complexity in him. Which could be one of the reasons why it takes him so long to acknowledge what's happening to him is not normal. It is indeed something scary. I think what the show really does is that get into this core idea that victimhood is not always legible, even to the victims. It is not very obvious to the person who is going through it to know exactly at what point did a relationship turn into harassment. And because of these factors where your emotions are so deeply entrenched with the person, that's difficult to disentangle the two. Let's start with our first disturbing fact of the day, which is about 80% of victims of stalking know the perpetrator personally. And 54% of stalkers are acquaintances or ex-partners. Let's sit with this. 80% of the cases, person who is being stalked is by someone they know, which in of itself tells you how complicated this one crime is, how difficult it is for them to be clear-eyed about it. Well, going back to the story, Dunn goes to the police eventually, and their first response is of skepticism. I think that might be the reason why no one really goes to the cops anymore. But the idea is that their first question is, why did it take you so long? And the answer lies in the complexity of everything I just spoke about. It is very difficult to know at what point Has your relationship turned into harassment? Has the number of messages you are getting are now just scary and uncomfortable? Maybe it is this dehumanizing aspect of going to a police where they constantly question your intent that people don't necessarily do that. In US, you would be surprised that there is 55% chance you would go to the police, which is like 45% of the people don't even go report what happens to them. And if you're a man, the chances are much lesser. Only 48% of the men in US would go and report a case. So that leaves us with 52%. Majority of the men essentially do not go to the cops. The show, though, shows him going to the police and there being some sort of an action. So while in the show she gets a prison sentence and there's formal restraining order, in real life, the comedian only got a first instance harassment warning, which is essentially they just told her to stop doing it in strict terms, and it stopped. Well, the performance of the actors is good enough for a reason to watch the show, but what I really would recommend is to see how they paint the stalker with as much humanity as they do it with the victim. And therefore, you realize that it's not as clear as one person is bad and the other is good. And therefore, you would be able to easily tell at what point does the reaction become harassment, right? Even the creator of the show, Richard Gadd, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, says that he wanted to show that people are a mixture of good and bad. And he said that he thinks stalker stories usually tend to be one person is good, one person is bad. And I wanted to get away from that. As someone who has truly lived through this instance, he saw that when you make the perpetrator so clearly bad, you essentially make it seem like the victim did not know. They were not smart enough. If this is so evident, why couldn't you just call it out? But it's not that clear. And therefore, it's important to show the human part of the complexity of both the sides. So if it wasn't depressing enough that it is more than 80% of the time that it's someone you know who stalks you, 90% of stalking victims are stalked by just one person during their lives. It is not a normal crime, it is an obsession. Like, case in fact, the show Done is a bartender being nice to a customer, which is very trivial on an everyday basis, right? You don't know what the other person's mental health is. And so, when he must have started getting the first few messages, he would have ignored it, as would we, right? We see a first few message and our reaction is to do something very basic, which is you ignore it or you just block them. But then, of course, like in the story, the person creates multiple profiles, reaches out to you through different formats. This sort of behavior is only applicable in online stalking, by the way. If you have somehow tried to push a person away in a physical life, it will be very difficult for them to take a new avatar and show up again, right? But there's this weird way in which we trivialize cyber stalking. And so you would get months of messages for someone and you would think, oh, I'll just block them. Oh, I'll block 3 of their profile. I'll block 15 of them. Even when he started having those unnerving feeling, it still did not reach the point where he thought he should call the cops. In the show, it's not until she shows up at his workplaces that you see him really be scared. You can really see the fear in his eyes. The actor does a brilliant job, but you can really see how it is only when the online threats show up in the offline world that people really even take it seriously. We don't react to just pure online threats as much. The problem is that this indifference or this trivializing does not really work. The perpetrators generally just keep escalating their actions. Even in the show, Martha goes from sending him messages to showing up at his workplace. And these messages also become more frequent, more intense, more intrusive. They start reaching out to your family and friends. And there is this weird sense of how a person not physically in your presence can completely unravel your real world. Mostly at this point, people would tell you to change phone numbers or take reactive actions like generally changing phone numbers, remove personal details online, deactivate your accounts, go offline. But the scary bit is that it is when you keep pushing the perpetrator away through these various blogs, do they start coming up into their real world. They start showing up at your workplaces, at your home, or, your commute. The offline and online dimensions start feeding off each other. And this is, again, a good time to remind you this is why it's called technologically facilitated gender-based violence, right? The idea that, again and again, I will repeat it till the end of the world, that technology is facilitating the real world violence. The person who's obsessive with you and is approaching you with this level of obsession will not limit it to the online sphere. And it's important that we treat the online presence of such threats or this level of stalking as a sign significant enough to take actions rather than to wait till the time things go offline. I think I have scared you enough to now introduce this topic. Stalking is defined as a repeated pattern of unwanted attention, contact, or harassment intended to cause fear or harm. Again, very quickly, it is essentially when you, in repeated patterns, it's very important that it's repeated. In repeated pattern, someone gives unwanted attention, contact, or harassment with the intent to cause fear or harm. It's very important to remember the intents because in one of the cases, a person stalking a woman was allowed to go free because they showed that their intention was not to create fear or harm. It is incredible how much this definition limits our ability to contain all of harassment, but the definition has to create a boundary. And so this is it. Cyberstalking is essentially using internet, email, or other electronic communication devices to stalk another person. That said, cyberstalking also has its own unique features, key differences that we need to understand if we want to reckon with this crime. I will just quickly list them so you know what to look out for when you see signs of cyberstalking. First, the difference in motives and tactics. Cyberstalking is more likely to be caused by lack of self-control than offline stalking because it is so frictionless and easy, even cheap, to stalk people online. It has essentially just removed all the hurdles that were there for anyone to stalk another person. It is also used extensively by ex-intimate partners, basically your romantic exes, to get a control on the victims. The second is victim-offender relationship. This by far is the most crucial difference between the two. Victims may be aware of the identity of the offline stalker, but an online world with anonymous profiles and with the ability to easily create new profiles and delete them, it is very difficult for anyone to find who's the cyber stalker they are dealing with. This imbalance even goes a step further because while the cyber stalker can remain unknown or anonymous, the victim has to face the repeated appearances, the obsessive messaging in a very public sphere. That said, it's not all bad. While it does create lasting impact on victims' reputation, their psychological well-being, on the positive side, cases of cyberstalking can lead to initiating self-protection actions early. You can block someone, you can limit their access on your devices. There are decisive ways in which you can push someone out of your circle, which might be difficult if someone's following you home. The most common victims of this public shaming or this public use of stalking platforms are female celebrities. For example, a California-based opera singer, Leandra Ramm, was harassed by a Singaporean man called Colin Mack for decades, and she never met him in this entire time. So Mac first contacted her online, posing as an opera director with employment opportunities. This is how he gained her trust, and she started talking to him and shared basic personal information on how to access her details. And Mac used all of that information to relentlessly harass her after that. He sent over 5,000 emails to opera producers, conductors, cast members, everyone, asking them to fire her from productions. He said he would show up with a gun if they do not do that. He sent photographs of weapons. He threatened to cut her face to physically attack her. She contacted local law, the FBI, even the UN. Can you believe the United Nations? All said they couldn't help. And ultimately, the case was broken by a forensic data expert, AJ Fardella, who, through a mutual friend, not through official channels, figured out a way to get in touch with the authorities in Singapore and got Mac prosecuted. Mac was sentenced to 3 years in prison in what is described as the precedent-setting first conviction for international cyberstalking. I think in this instance, we can also see the other key difference between cyberstalking and offline stalking, which is that people have to collaborate across borders and across sovereign powers to truly provide justice, which creates an impediment in creating the law instead. We will get into details on it later on, but it's a good example to keep in mind to remember how Leandra even went to United Nations and no one showed any help. And second, it took personal contacts to even make whatever happen because there were no legal infrastructures. But coming back to our point, the victim offender relationship here was essentially none. The person faked as an opera director once, and that was it. That was the only time she spoke to him as in one-on-one setting with consent. Everything after that followed was non-consensual. The third, lack of proactiveness in taking measures. Like we saw in the example of baby reindeer, Dunn took forever to reach the police. It's not because the crime was trivial, it is because he could not tell at what point should he raise the flags. He even only started being scared when his stalker started showing up in person. And so I think the difference between an offline and online stalking is that in offline stalking, the fear of severe repercussions forces the victim to ask for professional help or legal help early on. They do not just shun someone away or block them. They actually immediately take action. In contrast, cyberstalking generally sees victim gradually experiencing fear and there is a perceived lack of immediate threat. People are like, oh, it's just someone sending me messages which can be easily blocked and it doesn't affect any other aspect of my life. And as we'll see across the rest of the episode, that that's never true. Most of the times, these things perpetuate and grow into an offline repercussion. It's important to know that the lack of a legal recourse also makes people less confident in going to the cops or taking any real action. There's also lack of trust in the system. Like we saw in the show, the police's first reaction is skepticism and not concern, which creates a sense of burden on the victim. Finally, the third point, which is the age of perpetrators. This is purely based on a US-based study from 2010, which showed that cyberstalkers, because it is generally tech-based, tend to be younger, educated, well-performing, and more technologically sophisticated than the offline stalkers. Well, it is also very dated fact. It is from 2010, so I would take it with a bucket of salt. But it makes some obvious sense that people who use cyberstalking are more well-equipped or well-trained at technological devices. If you ask me, though, I would say that the biggest concern in the space of cyberstalking is not the lack of legal norms. I think they would follow if we know what we're talking about. I think the biggest problem currently is the fact that there is no academic comprehension of cyberstalking. People don't know what they're talking about. Everything gets clubbed into cyberstalking, and therefore, if everything is cyberstalking, then nothing is. So you've come this far. Great. This was part 1 of cyberstalking. I will soon be recording the part 2. In this one, I covered what is cyberstalking and how it is different from offline stalking. In the next one, I'll be talking about the legal ramifications and what are the plausible solutions. So I hope you enjoyed this. And of course, all the caveats, like, share, subscribe. And also, I have a bit of a bloopers. So wait around. Bye. This key difference makes cyberstalking a much more adapted form of stalking. And it has made it easy for even those who would have otherwise found the entire ordeal difficult. No, that's not the point, Devika. What the fuck? Center yourself. Okay. Hi, welcome to the Bol Breakdown.